We're going to spend the next 45 minutes or so taking questions from you for Dr. Carson this morning. We got 2 microphones here on the floor. We're just going to have you line up. 3. Oh, 3. There are 3. Okay, so there are 3. There's one in the middle. You'll just make a line in front of the microphone. I'm just going to help moderate a little bit. And so, Amelia, are you at the microphone? Okay. I don't know. Dave, is it on? It's on.
Is the covenant of Moses a covenant of grace, a covenant of works, or something in between from your studies? What do you think?
Yes.
That's cheating.
I'm a little nervous about the labels. That's why. I mean, there is a context in which, in Galatians, for example, the Mosaic covenant is seen as something of law and is not of faith. But on the other hand, we just saw in John 1:14 to 18 that what comes with Christ comes along replacing the earlier grace. So there is a sense in which the Mosaic covenant itself is a covenant of grace, in that it was given by grace for God's gracious purposes and part of the redemptive plan and so on. So the labels I'm often a little nervous to use unless I have a sit-down chat with you or whoever the person is and find out the framework in which you're bringing these things to the fore. Which means I've ducked again.
Hi, Dr. Carson. This is a sincere question about Ravi Zacharias. What happened to Ravi Zacharias really hurt me, and it's hurt a lot of people. And I'm wondering what you can share with us as Christians and as ministers about someone who has defended the gospel for decades and yet lived a double life.
Ever heard of Judas Iscariot? Or Peter denying the knowledge of Christ with oaths? In other words, when these things happen, they can hurt a great deal. They can do a lot of damage. There can be a lot of personal breakage and so on. But the one thing it should not be is surprising.
Is what?
Surprising. In other words, if Jesus had his Judas and his Peter and all the disciples who abandoned him and fled and so on, why should it be thought so unlikely that it should happen again? So I could tell you some stories of people I know personally and so on. I spoke with Ravi in 1 or 2 contexts and so on. I don't think it's my place to say much about him at the moment, other than the obvious public thing that needs to be said. The church is not a congregation of perfect people. It's a congregation of sinners saved by grace, and the overwhelming majority are on the way to increasing conformity with Christ. And where there's a disastrous falling away, God will sort it out at the end. But it should cause tears and self-examination and care, concern for those around him and all the rest. But it should not catch us by surprise.
Good. Please.
Hello, Dr. Carson. Thank you very much for being here today, for sharing. I work at Michigan State University, and I've worked there for about 15 years now. I work a lot with undergraduate students. And I'm just curious, most of the students know a great deal. It's not really about apologetics, but really what would you say to them as far as why should they accept Christ? They hear a lot of arguments, they hear a lot of discussions, but when it comes down to maybe their life isn't that bad, they're just, why should I accept Christ?
What I would say would depend very much on my perception of where they're coming from when they say that sort of thing. Some, when they say, why should I accept Christ, really mean, why should I accept your Christ as opposed to Buddhism or as opposed to whatever? And it's really coming out of the framework of deeply committed philosophical naturalism and pluralism. And I don't think it's easy to get close to what faith means until they come to grips with the exclusive nature of truth. But others are saying this because they have some superficial knowledge of the gospel, but they don't really see they have a need. So if they are coming across saying, I'm not really all that bad and I don't really need Christ, then somewhere along the line I'll smile, put an arm around his shoulder and say, you're far, far, far worse than you think you are. Because sooner or later you have to deal with the nature of sin. You just have to. So what kind of approach I would take would very, very much depend on my perception of where they are. And that comes out of drinking coffee with him at Starbucks and getting to know the bloke.
So you would say that the relationship is key, developing that relationship with them. Yeah, the other thing I get a lot on campus is if this is what Christ is, meaning against certain lifestyles or certain things, I don't want anything to do with him. So it sounds like I really would have to get a relationship going with the people.
Well, that's true for most witness. But when they say that sort of thing, I would follow Christ, except for the fact that he's against X or whatever X may be. I would probably smile and say, what do you think Christ is for? In other words, you have to get to some points of agreement somewhere along the line to start pushing back. But at the end of the day, some people are just really hardened, and you can't predict in advance exactly how people will respond to this response or that response. People are interesting.
Thank you.
Don, has it changed though? You've spoken on college campuses for decades.
Yeah.
Has it changed your initial approach when you were on a campus now? If you were going to do a presentation, is it different than it was 30 years ago?
Yes, I mentioned a couple of things last night, and I'll mention them again now. I said that it's easier, in my view, today to speak evangelistically on a college campus than it was 25 years ago. Because 25 years ago, there was still enough collegiate memory of Christian heritage or Christian background or the like that they knew what they were against. At least had some exposure to what they were against. And they knew they were against it because it was what their parents had or whatever. But today there is often so little knowledge of anything to do with Christianity that they don't know why they're supposed to hate me. And so if you go for coffee and jolly along and talk and so on, they're less intrinsically antagonistic. Unless there's currently on campus one particular issue that is firing off protests and this sort of thing. Occasionally I've been there, but usually it's not the case. And so I think that the degree of, just as the fact that in many sectors of the country, church membership is declining and so on. In one sense, this is a great boon. Now, in one sense, it's a mark of defection and decay and so on. But it's also becoming a little clear who's a Christian and who's not, and why they're Christian and why not. And that helps. That makes it a lot easier to draw some lines and say what people are becoming committed to or abandoning or whatever. And I remember a few years ago I was asked to talk to a young woman who was in the process of walking away from the faith. It's a long and complicated story. And as I talked to her, she suddenly burst into tears. And I thought, well, maybe the Lord's going to haul her back. And then as I listened to her some more, I found out what the tears were really about. They weren't sorrow at abandoning the gospel or abandoning the truth or turning away from Jesus. They were tears over her not wanting to disappoint her parents. But in that moment, I saw instantly and perfectly clearly how she had no allegiance to the gospel at all. Allegiance was to her parents. She didn't have a clue. I don't think there was a sign anywhere that she was genuinely converted. Yeah. And so you often don't see what the tears are about or where people are coming from or what's driving them until you push far enough in the conversation to see what's driving the issues and so on.
Good. Here.
Hi, Dr. Carson. I really appreciate your wisdom and teaching us all. My question is, I guess, about like healing and miracles and things along those lines. I know you made a couple of comments last night about if we want to see God's glory, we need to look to the cross, which I think is beautiful and totally true. And I guess my question is about it, like that is absolutely true. Also, where does the role of genuine healing and miracles come into play now, especially considering that they were such a big part of Jesus' ministry? I just want to hear your thoughts on that.
I wrote a book a few years ago called Showing the Spirit that takes you through 1 Corinthians 12 through 14 and the relevant passages in Acts, and then tries to work it out pastorally and theologically. So if you want to read more of what I think in that regard, that's the book to get. I will say this, but it's an entirely inadequate answer for such a complicated issue. It's easy to quote the texts in which Jesus does perform miracles, but it's also important to say, to quote the text in which Jesus says some pretty slighting things about it. You seek me not because you are listening to my words, but because you ate the food that I prepared for you yesterday and were satisfied. You want me to continue providing you with free meals. So people can look for miracles for many different reasons. And some Christians have taken the attitude, Christians whom I respect and admire a great deal, have taken the attitude that miracles ceased at the end of the apostolic age. That was really the stance of Benjamin Warfield. He wrote a book called Counterfeit Miracles, and that was his thesis. I think he was mistaken. On the other hand, I think it's equally mistaken to say that unless you have miracles flat out, plain and simple, you've got a truncated gospel. You read through the Bible and you discover that the miracles themselves come in clusters. There's one cluster with Moses and the crossing of the Red Sea and the things that take place. So there's another cluster with the onset of the prophetic age with Elijah and Elisha and so on, and another cluster with Jesus and the apostles. But I don't see any miracles taking place in the ministry of Hosea or Nehemiah. I don't see David performing miracles. In other words, the biblical patterns themselves are a lot more subtle than some people think who dogmatically want one side or another side approved and blessed and so on. So if the Lord wants... I can remember some of us were praying for the daughter of a pastor in our church a number of years ago. She's 50 now and so on, but she was dying of cancer. The doctors had said they should only give her palliative care. She had no more than days left to live. And the church didn't stop praying for her. And she woke up one morning and she said, "I'm hungry." 2 days later, they started doing x-rays and they couldn't find a trace of cancer anywhere in her. Well, you can call it spontaneous remission if you like. I'm more inclined to think of it as a miracle myself. But on the other hand, that hasn't been normative for me, and it wasn't at my hands or because I touched her. It was a church praying for her. I'm nervous about answers to questions about miracles that put all the answers in boxes that can be ticked and so on. I think it's a little more subtle than that. But God is merciful and He is powerful.
Hi, Dr. Carson. Thank you for being here with us and encouraging us with the truths of the Word. Yesterday, you had mentioned that you have a running list of questions that you'd like to ask God, and I was wondering what some more of those might be.
We'll see if we can get them answered here this afternoon.
Most of the questions I have to ask God are private. Sorry.
Thank you.
Nice try.
But let's be honest, you asked the question we all wanted to ask, so you're good.
Hi, Dr. Carson. I'm wondering about, so you obviously were integral with Tim Keller in bringing together this coalition around the gospel of broadly reformed Christians from all over the world. And, back then there seemed to be a great deal of energy around uniting, and today it seems like there's a great deal of energy around dividing and withdrawing from one another. So I'm wondering if you could reflect on your experience there and give me some advice as someone, what kind of things should a young pastor of a small church do to build coalitions locally, to build partnerships locally in light of some of these challenges that we face today?
There's not a formulaic answer to that because different times call for somewhat different things. What is seen in one context as divisive may in another context be principled rejection of a line too far. But what I would say is that we can exaggerate our analysis of what's going on in the culture. You are right to say that there are a lot more voices that are divisive today than when we started the coalition 15 years ago. But it would be a mistake to make the polarization too sharp. The fact is that the coalition has never been stronger. Its worldwide influence is humbling. And I could tell you story after story after story of the outreach of the gospel through the coalition. And its current crop of leaders on the executive and so on are men I admire and trust, and they're drawing lines at the right place and so on. So while others are... The way division often starts in is to find a target, in this case the coalition now because it's so much bigger. When we were small, we were nobody's target because we weren't significant. Now our profile is higher. People are much more likely to say things like, well, the coalition is all right, but... And the but really is to justify what they're doing. So part of the rise in our circles of yes, but type arguments is a reflection of how much fruitfulness and success we have seen, blessing of God we've seen. And so you just want to avoid playing the game. Especially in public, I try to be pretty careful about what I say about other ministries. And you don't want to define yourself primarily by what you're against. But you don't want to be afraid to be against some things that need repudiation and rejection. Make sure that they're principled, based on truth, exegesis, inherited confessionalism, and so on, and not on the basis of personalities and favored friends and that sort of thing. And at the end of the day, we all stand before God and give a defense of what we've said and done in the flesh, and what we long for is to hear him say, well done, good and faithful slave. You've been faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. And until that time, we have to wait to see how the books get ordered on the last day.
I have a two-part question. First of all, what do you have to say to someone who says, I don't need creeds or confessions, I don't need commentaries or books about Scripture, just give me Jesus and the Bible? And then secondly, if you get them to admit that maybe there's something more than their own understanding of who Jesus is and what the Scriptures have to say, how do you get them to consider Reformed or Puritan perspectives rather than, say, Roman Catholicism or Anabaptist perspectives? Maybe how do you get them to consider D.A. Carson rather than Benny Hinn or Jimmy Swaggart?
Well, if Benny Hinn wants to share some of his money with me that I can put into gospel ministry, I'm sorry. Jokes like that are bad taste. Well, when people say they just want Jesus and not confessionalism or something like this, you have to realize that that is being said out of a framework of spectacular ignorance. Now, you can't tell them that, but you recognize it for yourself. And when you find ignorance, there's no point slashing and squashing and killing. You've got to try and shed a little bit of light. And so I might say something like, just Jesus? Yes. The Jesus of Jehovah's Witnesses? He's got one of two ways he's going to go. Yeah, any Jesus, as long as it's Jesus. Is this the Jesus that is to be worshipped as God, or the Jesus that must not be worshipped as God? You try to get a forced confession of something about Jesus. Is this the Mormon Jesus? They probably don't know what that is, but if you were in Utah, they'd have some idea probably. If there's a possibility of having an ongoing discussion, when somebody says the sort of thing that you suggested, often they don't really mean to provide a serious response. It's not as if they've thought it through. It's a formulaic response. Just, I'm more spiritual than you are. I follow Jesus, and you just follow creeds. You know, which is so silly, it's embarrassing. But on the other hand, if they don't want to follow up with serious discussion, there's not a lot you can do but smile and try again next time. But if there's a place for following up, then it's drawing people back to a decision as to whether the Jesus in which they ostensibly believe is the Jesus who is there, the Jesus who exists, the Jesus about whom certain true things must be confessed and certain false things must be repudiated. Otherwise, it's not Jesus at all. It's a mental figure. It's a projection of the imagination. It's creation of my own preferences. And the name of that game is idolatry. And so those things can be brought up, but they have to be brought up winsomely and with time, usually. And the same with the next stage, which Jesus is got to be defended and defined on the basis of what Scripture says. You've got to get people into the Word one way or the other. Let's talk about the Jesus of Mark's Gospel. We'll do a study of Mark together, okay? Something like that.
All right, I'm trying to keep track here. I think we're in the middle and then back to back on the left and then back over here to the right.
Sure. I was just going to say, Dr. Carson, you've done a lot of ministry, and you've also raised 2 kids. What did it look like to prioritize your ministry to your kids in the demands of such great ministry going around outside of that?
I'm sure I'm not saying anything that you haven't thought of or heard from many people before. When the kids were young, I did my share of diapers. I was away quite a bit, but when I was there, I was the one that got them ready for bed, prayed with them. Our family devotions, we intended to make fun. With our kids, we read all the biblical narratives again and again and again until they knew the Bible stories. And my daughter, when she was 8 or 9, said something like, "Oh, Dad, we've read that story before. We want to do something now. What would you like to do?" "Well, how about Proverbs?" "Well, we haven't read Proverbs together as a family." Oh no, you're not ready for Proverbs. With her, revised psychology always worked. With my son, it never worked. Oh, you're not ready for it. Oh, okay, let's not do it then. They were just very different kids. And but when she was really steaming for it, then I read a chapter from Proverbs and selected in advance what one particular proverb and asked them to explain it to me. And we turned explaining Proverbs into a game that was fun. But we wouldn't have done that when the kids were 3. We played memory games when the kids were when she was 22 months, 23 months, she was already a voracious memorizer of nursery rhymes. My wife is English, and so she's brought up on an English diet of nursery rhymes and nursery stories and so on. She had 4 books, each of which had a nursery rhyme on one side and a picture on the other side. 25 of them in each book, 100 of them. She could open any one of those books and look at the picture and recite the nursery rhyme. And it dawned on me that if she could memorize all that stuff, she could memorize some Bible. So I started with 1 Corinthians chapter 1, the first paragraph, plus 1 Corinthians 13. Next night, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, second paragraph, plus 1 Corinthians 13. The next night, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, the third paragraph, plus 1 Corinthians 13. And after 2 weeks, I started dropping off the last word of each clause. Though I looked at Tiffany, speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a resounding gong. You know, I mean, she just dropped them in. These little minds just pick up stuff so fast, you know. And 2 weeks later, she reached over and grabbed she was sitting in her high chair. She reached over and grabbed my Bible. Tiffy, do it, she said, plunked it down, and recited 1 Corinthians 13. And by the time she was 3 1/2, she had about 26 chapters memorized. By that time, she had a baby brother, and the games had to change again, the rules had to change again, and so on. But what you can do when they're 1 1/2 or 2 and it's a game is not the same as what you can do when they're 13 or 14. So we tried hard to do different things that were suitable to their ages. But we don't guarantee their conversions. We pray for them. We love them. We still have good relationships with them. But at the end of the day, they have to stand before God on the last day and plead the blood of Christ, not Bible games with Daddy.
Hi, Dr. Carson. So often when I have conversations about God, especially to people that I disagree with politically or religiously, it always boils down to some controversial topics. So I just wanted to know, how do you keep the gospel as the center of that focus of that conversation without looking like you're dancing around or avoiding some of those controversial topics?
Risk looking as if you're dancing around controversial topics. In other words, it doesn't help to say, well, it's not the most important thing, but I think that politically you're right up the creek without a paddle. I mean, you can't get away with things like that. Somewhere along the line, you've got to say something like, I admit that there are political entailments that really are very important, but to me the most important entailment that my questions raise is, are you ready to meet God face to face? You've got to get back to those foundational things, or there's no framework in which the gospel makes sense.
Thank you.
All right. Hello, Dr. Carson. I had a couple questions about your travels. Since you've traveled abroad so much, I was curious if there are any specific ways that we as a church in the U.S. can be better supporting church growth in other countries, and if there are specific ways that we could be praying for them better than we normally do. I find it often that it's hard to know how to pray for churches in India or Russia or Ukraine. So I was curious if you had any insight on that.
Usually the best way to get information is from people who have lived there for years and years and years, who are themselves workers or natives from those countries, and befriending them and getting to know them on such grounds as this. I mean, I could list some worthy organizations that need help in North India at the moment. But on the other hand, I'd want them to know as well that American labels in North India are dangerous, and that there are ways of doing things that strengthen the church, and there are other ways of doing things that strengthen the American Mission Society. And that in many, many contexts, there are things that we are to learn from the church. A couple of days ago, I finished reading a book by Wang Yi and friends from the house church of the Early Rains Covenant Church in Shengdo. And there are things that we learn from them, just as there are ways in which we could conceivably help them. But the best thing you can do if you're concerned to help them is talk with people who do know those areas, who do know those people who've lived among the particular culture and so on. It's just too easy to have a formulaic answer that works in some parts of the world and doesn't work in other parts of the world.
Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Carson. So I've wrestled through the years with how our family should treat Sunday and how we should, think about that. And I've had, I could say, an addiction to football at times, so making that a God in my life and at points in my life. So my question is, in your opinion, how important is it for Christians to set aside one day in 7 for rest and worship, and why? And then what are your personal habits for that particular day? As I'm guessing you do.
I edited a book on the subject called From Sabbath to Lord's Day almost 50 years ago. I've changed my mind a little bit on some points, but it is worth recognizing that there are shades of viewpoints on some of those Sabbatarian issues that cannot be resolved in the context of a Q&A session. They're deep and they're complex and so on. I do remember that my dad, who was a pastor and was pretty strict about what we couldn't do on Sunday, which he viewed as the Christian Sabbath. Nevertheless, though he was pastor of a church and was always preaching that evening, he made time Sunday afternoons to play games with his kids. So my childhood memory is not dominated by what we couldn't do. My childhood memory of Sunday was playing games with Dad and singing around the piano. And it was a happy time. Those are the associations in my mind. So that it's not so much the legal structures of what you allow or don't allow. It's what you actually do with it that shapes your kids. And there, it seems to me, we ought to give a lot of thought and care and attention to priorities. More than that, give me a weekend conference or something and we can talk about it.
Fair enough.
Anthony.
Thank you so much for being here. I love the topic of this conference. It's something I'm passionate about in my own reading. In the City of God, Augustine says that Noah had to put the door in the side of the ark as a type of the spear going into the side of Christ. I've always struggled with this as a type. I just don't see how Augustine came to that conclusion. If you would agree with that, or if you don't, how can we avoid going too far in seeing Christ in the Old Testament?
It's a good question. The rule of thumb is there has to be exegetical warrant in Scripture itself for justifying the typology. Typology is not word association games or some obscure parallelism that is not mandated by the text. There's different kinds of typology, but all of them that are biblically warranted are just that, biblically warranted. And it's interesting that some cases are long-standing points of debate. Many books over the centuries have been written on whether Joseph is a type of Christ. He's not picked up in the New Testament in the same way that Abraham is picked up, for example. And so I waffled back and forth. But I'm editor of various series, and one of the series is called New Studies in Biblical Theology. We're into our 60s, whatever it is, book at the moment. And a couple of years ago, we published one by a chap called Emadi, a young Reformed scholar who's written what is now, in my view, the definitive book on Joseph as a type of Christ. He's nailed it. It's a very, very good book. So there's sometimes more things that can be studied and learned and taught and so on from somebody who really devotes a good chunk of his or her life to something like that and say something fresh. But where something turns on one connection, like the scarlet color of Rahab's cord, referring to the blood of Christ, because after all it's red. It's pushing. You can see an analogy, but I'm not sure it's in the mind of the Old Testament writer. It's not picked up anywhere in the New Testament writer. It's not something I'm going to preach from the pulpit. There's so many things that need to be preached from the pulpit because they are there. Why should I spend a whole lot of time pushing from the pulpit things which at best may conceivably, plausibly be there, but are certainly not mandated by Holy Writ? So a certain healthy skepticism in handling typology is wise.
Follow up real quick, because you touched on those gray books. What's the name of the series?
New Studies in Biblical Theology, NSBT.
There are a lot of series out there that, you choose, there are a few different good volumes in it. Probably read 15, 20 of those. They're dynamite. I mean, if you're looking for something a little more scholarly, you're trying to think through things, but it's accessible, man, those are wonderful volumes. So write those down.
I can push them because I didn't write them. I just edited them.
They're great.
And we're now about volume 63 or 64, something like that, with 5 more signed up. And so we keep adding more. Every once in a while, the publisher asks me, "Do you think we've done this long enough?" And my answer is always the same. Are you still making money? From a publisher point of view, that's a serious question, because if you're not making money, you can't keep in business. And he said, "Yeah, they're doing very well." I said, "Okay, let's sign up for another 5 or 10." And so that's how it's kept going.
Okay. You get a look behind the scenes. All right. We got 7 minutes here, so we'll try and go fast.
I love your Canadian accent.
I don't have an accent. You do.
I've been told that. Just thinking about a bill that's been recently put out that is related to changing the definition of marriage, and although it's already been redefined, it brings me to the question of your recommendations or your thoughts about how that could impact pastors and people in leadership where they're potentially going to be asked, and the concern of how that impacts the church. I know there's been people that say that it's kind of a backdoor attack on Christianity as their faith and beliefs in that regard.
It's complicated. As far as I can see, that both in Canada and in the United States, most of the people who are pushing for a redefinition of marriage are not doing so primarily because they are against Christianity. They haven't even considered Christianity. They're so far removed from that frame of debate that it's not an issue for them. What they're doing is, from their point of view, protecting the rights and privileges and normalcy of something that the Bible, from our perspective, actually condemns. And the fact that it's got as far as it has, and as many legislations as it has, is a reflection of the decline of moral consensus in the Western world. Where this will go, I don't know. In both countries, but especially in the U.S., there are groups of Christians that are binding themselves together in tertiary education or in lawsuits and so on to try to challenge certain things. And just because legislation is passed does not necessarily mean that's where it ends up, because things are then tested by the courts and they go for years and years and years and years. I don't know how it's going to come out. Worst case, it could come out such that if you don't conform, you go to jail, and then you go to jail. But that's the worst case. You see, supposing you lose the right to officiate at weddings because you won't do a homosexual wedding, I'd say, fine, then I don't officiate at weddings. You see, there's nothing in Holy Scripture that says that weddings, to be Christian, have to be conducted by an elder or a pastor of a church. That is one of the tail-ons from medieval Catholicism. Marriage was viewed as a sacrament, and only an ordained priest could discharge the sacraments. So in France, for example, if you're a Christian couple and you want to get married in church, you still have to go to a justice of the peace and get married officially before them. That's what counts. And then what happens in the church is what you do in the church. That's different. So it's already like that there. So you need to be careful where you're drawing the line. You don't want to draw the line in the wrong place. But you can conceive of various ways in which this could get into a situation where you're mandated to do something, you can't do it, it's a matter of conscience before God, and you go to jail. Yeah, of course it could happen. And then what you have to say is it'll be an honor to serve Christ in that way.
Because it seems like, I know there's been a lot of movement to change the church's bylaws so that it's written in, but it doesn't seem like that would necessarily have an impact legally if.
Well, that depends too. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not putting on a lawyer's hat. Sure. But one of the ways you can legitimately defend yourself is to make clear what the church has as a church passed as bylaws, so that you are acting within the constraints of the agreed rules of the assembly. If you don't do that, then you can be charged with being inconsistent, with having favorites, with being guilty of inequity because you're handling different people differently. And that can often be cleaned up with a little more care on your bylaws.
Thank you.
All right, Lucy.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
I'm one of the ones that didn't hear you last night too well. But my question is about prophecy. In the Old Testament, the prophets usually speak to Israel themselves.
Would you just stand a little closer to the mic?
Prophets usually spoke to Israel themselves as a people. In the New Testament, there are prophets, but how do they speak to them? And I know I considered the word wisdom and possibly encouragement to a particular person to be a type of prophecy, but how does one speak publicly to a certain people?
Well, that varies enormously, even in the Old Testament, let alone the New Testament or today. Some speak by writing a column in a newspaper. Some use the digital world, television. Some speak in a small group Bible study in your home. Some have a crowd of 500. So I think that it is usually pretty dangerous for us to try to specify precisely the mode and format and sphere of delivery when the Bible does not often go so far as to mandate one particular word.
And if a prophecy doesn't come true, what happens to the prophet?
Well, in Deuteronomy 13 and following, there are warnings about a prophecy. A prophet that says something is going to take place at a certain time and place and so on, and it doesn't take place, he's proved to be a false prophet. And then there are judgments that are meted out. So that if in a congregation, likewise, somebody's claiming that the Bible is teaching something that the word of the Lord says and so on, and it is plainly and demonstrably untrue, that person should be discharged from public ministry.